This is the Tree of Life, Season 11, Chapter 9. In this episode, we will be talking about entropy from the standpoint of this season. To start out, when two individuals intersect, when one negates, it produces a dissonant space. This dissonant space is followed by a substitution event along that path, in the ordinary course, and with the conclusion of that substitution event, a return to time parsimony through the causal reordering from the lowest, most convoluted path, to the highest. There are 9 descending levels corresponding to each intersection, where each is described by a distinct substitution event. Many of those lower, more convoluted paths describe additional intersections, which produce 9 more convoluted paths, and so on and so forth. But the key point for this discussion that must be drawn from this point is that all of those convoluted paths substitute upwards until the second least convoluted path replaces path parsimony in the eyes of the conjoined consensuality. This tells us a few things. It tells us that, when an intersection occurs between person A and person B, and produces 9 descending paths for each intersection, the entropy represented by those manifold paths is reflected in the distribution of objects within the local space. Let me explain what I mean. If we return to the example of the individual seated at a table, person A, we note that person B, in path 1, walks across the room and sits opposite him, but first places a post-it note on the table in front of him. In path 2, path parsimony, person B merely walks across the room without placing a post-it note in front of him. Yet, we see that in the resumption of time parsimony, the post-it note is still on the table, even though person A remembers path parsimony, path 2. This reveals that these more convoluted paths represented by the interaction of A and B, up to 9-fold, with magnification of those by a factor of 9 for each new intersection, import the entropy represented by the intersection of all those convoluted paths into time parsimony for both actors. Thus, although person A remembers path 2, the objects around which person A and person B are oriented possess information associated with path 1, the more convoluted path. This is interesting for a few reasons. 1. We saw that a dissonant consensuality creates desynchronization between actors and asynchronicity for one actor. This desynchronization can be characterized as representing an increase in entropy within the social grouping. The desynchronicity, represented by a dissonant space, is associated with self-consciousness by need. Which is to say, that perhaps the sublimation generated at the end of a substitution event represents the mediation of entropy within the environment with entropy as between people. Let me explain. We saw that during a dissonant space, there are 9-fold convoluted paths. We saw also that at the conclusion of that substitution event, time parsimony continues, which represents a true increase in the entropy represented within the conjoined consensuality by that sequence of events from path parsimony. Since we saw also that this substitution represented by the causal reordering involves the retrospective increase in local entropy, we can observe that perhaps the causal reordering which occurs due to path parsimony being superseded by time parsimony involves the internal system, represented by all observers, matching the external system, represented by external objects. Now, we also saw in more recent episodes that conventionally, hybrid structures, which form within dissonant spaces, producing this accordion-like causal reordering, form in pairs. This means that when those paired structures interact, it severs the descent of the more convoluted paths, and the dissonant space migrates laterally. In this arrangement, each substitution event represents a perfect substitution, the distribution of all negated impulses relative to some distinct objects occurs horizontally instead of vertically. We can imagine that this more typical interaction is associated with a more conventional transition of entropy or information within the system. Which is to say, we don't see the retrospective causal reordering, which represents greater systemic entropy within the environment. To put it another way, imagine for a moment that while within a dissonant space, you are riding the fence between 2 parallel universes with distinct rates corresponding to the arrow of time. When you sublimate, those verbalizations are associated with you stepping into the universe with a transition to greater environmental entropy from one moment to the next, though you may remember the one with less. That's the end of the podcast for today.